At 4:32 on April 22, 1943, I was 350 meters from the Japanese sniper's last known position, armed with a second-hand rifle that had been labeled as obsolete by every officer who'd seen it. The barrel was slightly warped, the scope misaligned, and the ammunition, well, it wasn't even the right type for the weapon. It was supposed to be a suicide mission, a training exercise for someone who hadn't proven himself in combat. That's what the others had said when they saw me standing alone with my gear, as if I was a temporary solution to a bigger problem. They didn't believe in me, but I wasn't there to prove anything to them. The sniper's position was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that precedes the worst of battles. They had seen me coming, and they knew exactly what I was capable of, or rather, what they thought I wasn't capable of. They would learn differently. To understand why I was there alone, you have to understand how little confidence anyone had in me. I was a corporal in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, stationed in the Pacific Theater, 1943. My role was primarily reconnaissance, a position often delegated to those with less combat experience, or so they believed. I wasn't an officer, and I wasn't a combat specialist. I'd been in uniform for just under 3 years, and in that time, I'd mostly been assigned to tasks that the higher-ups didn't want to waste anyone important on. My training, however, had been unconventional. I'd spent years working with marksmen in isolated conditions, honing skills not typically taught in formal settings. The rifle I had used before enlisting had been a custom job, modified for long-range precision. I wasn't a specialist in tactics or strategy, but I had the experience of someone who understood the precision required to make a shot count. That didn't make me any more qualified in the eyes of my peers. On the surface, I was just another soldier with a name tag and a rifle, no different from the rest. The others didn't understand why I'd been selected for this assignment. They couldn't see past my uniform, and they saw me as nothing more than a desk jockey who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My background wasn't glamorous enough for them to give me any credit. When I suggested that I could take care of the sniper problem, that I had the experience to neutralize a target at long range, there were snickers in the briefing room. One officer, a lieutenant who had been in the field longer than most of us, scoffed. "Sure," he said, "you'll be just as good as that custom rifle you've got. Let's see if it holds up out there." I didn't respond. I wasn't there to defend my background or my qualifications. The rifle I carried was hardly the issue. It wasn't about the weapon. It was about the skill behind it, something none of them had the patience to understand. And yet there was one credential that none of them knew about. I had trained with a sharpshooter who had been credited with over 200 confirmed kills in the Great War. It wasn't something I volunteered, but it had shaped my methods, my approach to the fight. My eyes, my patience. They were products of that training, not some formal military doctrine. I was the last person anyone expected to solve this problem, but that problem was about to land on my desk. By the time I was called in, the situation had already escalated. The sniper had become a recurring nightmare for my unit, one that we couldn't shake, no matter how many men we sent out, no matter how many strategies we tried. The enemy had found a position that was both elusive and lethal. He wasn't a lone soldier making random shots. He was a methodical, adaptive force, forcing us into a position where every step we took felt like a misstep. The reports came in fast. One casualty, Sergeant Walters, 600 meters from the perimeter. Another, Corporal Diaz, 3rd attempt today. Down by a shot before he could even see the shooter. We'd tried flanking positions, artillery bombardments, even calling in air support. Nothing worked. With every failed attempt, the enemy seemed to adapt, shifting positions, using the terrain to his advantage. It was as if the sniper knew what we were planning before we did. Command wasn't blind to the mounting losses. Pressure was growing by the hour. Every man sent to handle the sniper came back with the same grim report. Couldn't locate the target. Shot before I could even take a proper position. The rifle teams were just as baffled as the officers. We had the best equipment and we had the best men, but this wasn't a standard engagement. The sniper wasn't just firing from concealed positions. He was studying us. He knew our tactics, our movements, and how to exploit the narrow windows between the standard military approaches. Conventional methods had failed because they were based on assumptions. We thought we could push him out with brute force or simple maneuvers, but the enemy had outgrown those techniques. It wasn't about the weapon, it was about how they fought. The urgency was no longer a whisper in the background. It was now the unspoken weight of every conversation in the command tent. We couldn't afford another failure. Not only was the sniper claiming lives, but morale was beginning to erode. The officers were desperate. That's when the decision came. Conventional methods had run their course. It was clear. No one had an answer, but I would have to find one. The orders came through shortly after the meeting in command. I was to go out alone. A team had failed. 2 teams had failed. Now, I would be sent to locate the sniper. No backup, no reinforcements. Just a rifle and the open terrain. I moved out at 3:45, the sky still dark with the faintest hint of the early morning fog settling in. The terrain was rocky, dotted with patches of scrub, broken only by the occasional low rise in the earth. Visibility was limited to 150 meters. The mist clinging to the ground and making the world appear muted, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The air was cool, just above freezing. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible in the dim light. It was quiet, too quiet. Every step on the uneven ground felt deliberate, though I knew better than to rush. This wasn't a race. It wasn't about reaching the target faster. It was about making one shot count. I positioned myself behind a boulder, using it to shield me from any potential line of sight. From here, I could see the brush line ahead, dense enough to hide a man, but sparse enough to offer a few sight lines. I waited for the space between heartbeats to stretch. The sniper knew we were coming. The question was, would he think we would come from the same angle we always did? The wind was light, moving from my right to left. My rifle was steady in my hands. I adjusted the scope, calculated the wind drift. A half-minute later, I saw movement at the far end of my field of view. A silhouette against the mist. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The shot was clean. The sniper never saw it coming. The shot hit its mark. It wasn't a dramatic kill. No celebration, no time for victory. Just one clean, restrained success in a series of failures. The field report would note the casualty as confirmed, nothing more. With the first shot taken, I moved out again, this time not as someone trying to prove themselves, but as someone tasked with a job. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this was the first step. The sniper would adapt, and the game would change. The morning after the first shot, things changed. The sniper hadn't been a random, solitary threat. He had been observing, learning. The reports came in quickly. The sniper had moved positions, but this time there was no sign of hesitation. The bullets that followed weren't aimed at the obvious spots, the predictable angles we had all assumed. It was clear he had adapted. He knew I was out there, and he knew I was hunting him. I moved again, tracking the same 350-meter stretch of terrain. This time there was less mist, but more risk. Visibility was better, but that only meant the sniper would be able to spot me from further away, should he be positioned right. The terrain was still rough, but now it felt like it was working against me. The same rocks that had once provided cover now presented obstacles to maneuver. I waited for a long time. I knew he was watching. The hours stretched, each minute filled with the possibility of a single mistake, a single misstep that would end the operation. I adjusted my position, but nothing came. Silence, nothing. The kind of silence that raises a nagging suspicion. And then I saw it, the glint of sunlight catching a scope off to my left. Barely visible through a patch of low scrub, he had moved to a higher position, one I hadn't considered. It wasn't just that he had learned from the previous encounter. He had anticipated it, adjusted. A corner had been turned. The next moment was instinctive. I dove for cover, the rifle skimming over the edge of the rock as I hit the ground. The crack of the sniper's shot rang out moments later, splitting the air. The bullet ricocheted off the rock where my head had just been, the impact like a warning bell. It was no longer simple, no longer clean. The margins for error had narrowed sharply. I wasn't just playing the sniper's game. I was forced to adjust, to adapt at the same pace he was. There was no more room for hesitation. Every decision from here on out carried weight, risk, each one more calculated than the last. This had stopped being a mission. It had become a duel. The shift in dynamics was immediate. What had started as a straightforward operation now felt like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. I wasn't just hunting the sniper anymore. He had adapted, and now I was the one being tracked. I spent hours in my new position, hidden behind a low ridge. The land stretched out before me, flat with only a few sparse trees to break the sight lines. I was careful, deliberate, every movement calculated, down to the last muscle twitch. The silence had returned, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of the wind. I knew he was out there. He knew I was out there. But neither of us moved. Time dragged on. Then the idea came. I set up my rifle, placed a small pack of gear out in the open, just outside my immediate line of sight. It wasn't much, just a pack I had emptied and placed on the ground. Enough to serve as bait. If he was still watching, as I suspected, he would see the small, seemingly careless setup. It wasn't much, but in this game, it would be enough to tempt him. I waited. After what felt like hours, I finally saw movement at the edge of my vision, a slight shift in the brush. It wasn't immediate. He was studying the bait. He had seen it, but he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. This time, he wouldn't rush it. The patience on both sides was excruciating. I felt the pressure in my chest, the ticking clock. Every second felt as though it could cost me everything. I had no choice but to wait for the exact moment, the split-second opening that would let me make the shot. Finally it came. A flash of movement. A figure crouched low, moving towards the pack. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but enough to confirm what I had suspected. He was on the move. I held my breath. The timing had to be perfect. I adjusted the scope, my hands steady but my mind racing. I couldn't afford a mistake, not this time. The sniper paused just for a fraction of a second, scanning the terrain. It was enough. My rifle cracked through the silence. The shot landed clean. He didn't fall immediately. There was a moment. Just a moment of stillness before he crumpled behind the brush. A hit. The sniper was down. But the satisfaction didn't last. I didn't have time to appreciate the clean kill. The second I took the shot, I knew something was wrong. The ground beneath me shifted, the air thick with the understanding that this duel was far from over. The sniper might be down, but the price of even a single miscalculation would be my life. The risk hadn't diminished. It had just changed form. By then, both sides knew exactly what was at stake. The shot had barely registered when I realized something. The sniper wasn't alone. A second shot, muffled but unmistakable, echoed from the opposite direction. It wasn't immediate, but the sound was deliberate. There had been no sign of movement before the first kill. Now I was certain. The sniper had been baiting me, setting a trap, a misdirection. I paused. I didn't rush. I couldn't afford to. Panic would only make it worse, and the mistake would be fatal. My first instinct was to move, reposition, to get a better angle. But I held my ground. Patience was everything now. This wasn't the time for hasty decisions. I knew that rushing in would only give the enemy the opening they had been waiting for. Instead, I scanned the terrain, using the knowledge I had gained over the past few days. The layout hadn't changed. The sniper's position from the previous engagement was still fresh in my mind, the key details of the terrain still vivid. I could see where he would likely have moved. But this wasn't just about avoiding the trap. It was about using the enemy's plan against them. I kept my rifle on the same spot, never shifting my aim. The wind had shifted slightly, just enough to adjust for the trajectory. I noticed it in the same fraction of a second. I noticed the faintest trace of movement ahead, a shadow passing across the rocks. The kind of subtle shift that would be missed by anyone rushing in. It was the second sniper, moving into position. He thought I hadn't noticed. He thought I was too focused on the first target, too distracted by my success to recognize the trap. But the sniper was wrong. I waited. I waited for the exact moment when the second sniper would commit to his position. I held my breath and slowed my pulse. It was a test of patience, but more importantly, it was a test of restraint. The second sniper reached the point of exposure. He was set up, prepared to take the shot, but he was now in my crosshairs. I adjusted the scope, made a minor correction for wind, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. Just like that, the second sniper was down. 2 confirmed kills. But it wasn't just about the kills. It was about the trap, the decision to refuse to rush. The sniper had tried to use my own impatience against me. Instead, I used his plan to my advantage, dismantling it with nothing more than intelligence, patience, and restraint. This wasn't just skill anymore. It was a game of minds, and I had outlasted them. The operation had shifted again, but this time it wasn't a duel. It was a hunt. The next few days were a blur of heightened tension and dwindling options. The enemy adapted faster than I could anticipate. My position, once secure, now felt exposed. The terrain had changed again, shifting with the seasons, the visibility narrowing even further. The sniper, or what remained of him, was part of a bigger problem, one that had become personal for both sides. My resources were running low, ammunition was nearing the end, and I was forced to make choices about how to conserve it, knowing every shot counted. My water supply was dwindling too. I was isolated, with no backup. I was becoming the target, and the risk of failure was no longer theoretical. It was right there, waiting for a single misstep. There was no more waiting, no more patient observation. This time, I would have to move. At 6:04, I made my way to the edge of the hill, a position I had avoided earlier, knowing it would be too obvious. But the sniper had gotten smarter, and this was the only place left where he could be. There was no more time to consider alternative routes. My calculations were already done. I had no backup, no contingency plan. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. My rifle felt heavier than it had before. Every step forward felt like a gamble. I reached the ridge. The wind was light, coming in from the left. I moved into position and waited, scanning the horizon, listening. And then I saw him, not in the same spot as before, but moving, adapting once more. He had done it again. I had one shot. One opportunity to finish this. I adjusted my aim, aligning my shot with the precise angle I had memorized earlier. The wind didn't shift this time. It was perfect. I squeezed the trigger. The shot landed. He didn't move after that. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just the quiet hum of my heartbeat, steady, and the stillness of the terrain around me. When I reported in, it was a simple statement. The sniper threat had been neutralized. I didn't offer anything more. They didn't laugh at the equipment anymore.